Thank you. Good morning. Welcome. My name is Nilgun Anadolu Okur. I am a professor at the Africology department. This is my 33rd year in this department, which I call my home. And of course, it is a family place for all of us, but especially for me because I'm away from my native land. I welcome you to our 23rd year. I owe thanks to a couple of people. Our department chair, Dr. Mazama, who couldn't be here because she had to attend another conference. Our administrator, TJ Cusack. Our coordinator, Miss Janice Vincent. And of course, one of our best graduate students, a brilliant individual who joined our program all the way from California, Mr. Jordan QB. I am so proud and thankful because of his efforts. He's also my research assistant, and I'm very proud. We, of course, take pride in our students' success. One of these people is the keynote speaker today, Dr. Jordan Denson, who is now teaching at Lincoln University. Let me give you a brief introduction and introduce my co-founder, Dr. Andy Waskie. This conference began 23 years ago with both of us thinking about doing something about Black history. And Underground Railroad 23 years ago was a topic that was not well known or well researched. So we said, why don't we start an academic conference that will look into the reality, the truth, and the agonies and maybe the happiness of Black people rather than depending on myths, which are not always facts. So we started our own research. As we grew in terms of our research, many kinds of information started pouring. And Dr. Waskie, who was then at Temple University faculty, now he's retired, was of course giving us lots of feedback with his expertise in Civil War history. He's also an impersonator of General Portrayer of, General Meade. Okay. The other thing we did with Andy, which has a 10-year background, is start this interesting and very exciting memorial program, laying the wreath to the statue at South Philadelphia when you turn your face towards South Road. Cato, Major Octavius Valentine Cato, will be standing next to you. So every year, with Andy and his group of Civil War soldiers, and thanks to them, USCT, they never leave us alone. We lay a wreath for the department on behalf of the department, but it is really Andy's work because he started the Cato Medal. He will talk more about who Cato is. I will invite him to speak in a minute. We had very humble beginnings. Our first conference in 2004 took place in the Student Activities Center in a tiny, dingy room. We could not find another room, and nobody would support the rental fee of a lounge. And in those days, we didn't have a public policy lab like this one. So it was really very humble. On top of that, the person who really did lots of research and opened the gates for us, Dr. Blockson, was quite upset that we were doing this conference, although he was invited and he came to speak. He was also scolding me, and not Andy, but probably me. Who are you? So young, an assistant professor, talking about Underground Railroad. He was right. I knew very little, but now I need to learn more about this. It keeps going and going. We never stop. Over the years, my department adopted the conference happily. I'm very thankful to my former chair people. We have, of course, completed today the 23rd year. We are also active in the community work, as I said before. We join all events as much as we can. Over the years, we covered many topics from Harriet Tubman to the architect. We invited him, Mr. Alvin Pettit, a few years ago, who is creating the monument for Harriet Tubman, which will be placed also at the City Hall facing north. We spoke about John Brown, we spoke about Camp William Penn, and women heroes of the Underground Railroad. We had a conference on USCT, the colored soldiers. and I mentioned before, we invited Alvin to tell us how he's creating this beautiful monument. Dr. Jeremy Menis from Geography of CLA came a few years ago and gave us a very exciting information. He is creating digital maps using the very advanced technology of GSI to find out, for instance, where Harriet Tubman started, how many miles she walked, where did she stop. So his research is coming along, and there is an article being published which we co-wrote with him. It will be published in Journal of History Studies soon. So, almost ending, we believe in hard work, we believe in excellence, and we represent, of course, Black people's history who chose freedom rather than enslavement.
All right, and now that the tone has been set, we will move into our keynote speaker for the morning, Dr. Jordan Denson. I'm just going to read some points from his biography. Dr. Jordan Denson is a lifetime resident of Chester County, Pennsylvania, in which he grew up in Oxford. Dr. Denson graduated from Lincoln University, Pennsylvania in the year 2009 with a Bachelor's of Science degree in History and a minor in Black Studies. He also earned a Master's of Arts degree in 2011, as well as his Doctor of Philosophy degree from Temple University, Africology and African American Studies. His dissertation is entitled African Agency Within the Surrounding Chester County, Pennsylvania Area from the year 1850 to 1865. Currently, Dr. Denson is a tenured track assistant professor in the Pan-Africana Studies Department at Lincoln University. And his topic for us today is going to be focused on the courage and perseverance of African agency within the surrounding Chester County of Pennsylvania. So everyone, I present to you Dr. Jordan Denson.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you for the warm welcome. I do appreciate that. It's good to be back home. As mentioned before, I'm a graduate of Temple University from a master's degree and my PhD in the Department of Africology and African American Studies. And it's always good to be back here. I was here in October of last year and for the DIOP conference, so I'm always happy to be back. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Okur. Thank you, Dr. Peterson and Lewis, who were my professors when I was here, as well as others. So I thank you for being here. But yes, for today, much of my research has focused on a place where I grew up in Chester County, Pennsylvania. And as a kid, I always had initial interest in terms of the area that I lived. I knew Chester County was an old county when I was a child. I didn't know how old it was. I knew people of African descent had been in the area for a long time, but I did not necessarily know how they arrived there, why they came to this area. Some of the families I would be somewhat related to, some of the Black families in Chester County, and especially Oxford, but many of them I were not, but I went to school with a lot of people who had the same family name, like the Palmers, or the Grays, or the Walls, and these were some of the prominent Black families that had been around in the Oxford area. So as a kid, I used to ask my parents some of these questions. How did Black people get to Chester County? Why did they come to Chester County? How long had they been here? Even though I lived within 5 miles of Lincoln University, Pennsylvania felt like it was 100 miles away. And why is there a disconnect between the Oxford community and Lincoln University? In many regards, still exists today. So I used to ask some of those questions, and it was a curiosity thing for me. And I did not know it would ultimately lead me down this path. In terms of when I came to Temple University for my doctoral degree, I did not necessarily have an idea at first in terms of what I was going to research. But it took me down this path of, hey, maybe there's something here that I could look at. And then it became a matter of just focusing on the years. And I was able to come to find out a great deal of information that has been personal to me. Some of it involving history related to my family. Others involved history related to my home church in Akron, Pennsylvania, and others in other areas that I either had passed by, driven by, walked by. So this became a very personal journey for me as I went through this process. And one of the things that I want you to remember is that in going through some of this history to get you in terms of what was the environment, what were some of the legislation that was going on that shaped some of these early histories in terms of people of African descent being in Pennsylvania and Chester County, is that despite these challenges African communities face in Pennsylvania, African people were able to continue and exhibit courage and perseverance, and in many ways that still continues on today. Right? So one of the things I looked into is wanting to know, even before people of African descent arrived to Chester County, what were some of the Native American groups that were here, that were there, as well as other parts of Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey as well, but specifically more in the Chester County area. And in the area that's considered Chester County today, was first occupied by the Delawares and the Lenape, Native Americans. And this was prior to European Americans coming about, as well as people of African descent. There are a few locations in Chester County today that still have Native American names. So if anybody's been to anywhere, Lenape, Pocopson, Octorara, or Tough Kenneman, these are some of these Native American names in reference to some of the Native American people that were there. So that kind of gave me a baseline in terms of understanding, okay, who were the people that were here prior? Chester County itself, the African presence and agency within Pennsylvania can be detected as early as the 1630s. So before Chester County even becomes a British colony, there are people of African descent that are there. Many of them were enslaved by the Swedes, by the Dutch, and there's early histories that discuss some of these people that were there and what they were doing. Of course, Chester County does not become a British colony later on. It's founded by, quote unquote, founded by William Penn later on, and it'd be a part of what becomes the New World. But Chester County was very important in terms of what being one of those early counties that came about with Pennsylvania. And for me, this is Oxford, the borough of Oxford, in which I grew up. Then you have Lower Oxford, Upper Oxford as well, and I'll touch upon some of that as well. But these are some of the places that even I live. I grew up in Oxford, but there's other places I lived in. Avondale, this is where my mom's family grew up. Kennett Square is a big part of the Underground Railroad, especially during the 1800s, a lot of abolitionists. And as you can see, Delaware is close by here, so you had those that were seeking liberation, as well as abolitionists living in this area for quite some time because of having Maryland and Delaware so close by. In terms of Pennsylvania counties within itself, one of the things that I was able to understand in my research is that in every single Pennsylvania county, there is some form of Underground Railroad activity. There's some form of resistance, all right? Because when I did my research, I was looking at mainly Chester County, Lancaster County, York County. However, I did look at things out in the western portion of the state, as well as the northern, and I came across almost in every single county where there was some type of Underground Railroad activity depending on the timeline and what information was available. African enslavement was something that existed within Pennsylvania under William Penn's governorship, in which he was a Quaker enslaver himself. And he wasn't a large time person, he wasn't a big time enslaver. However, he did have several enslaved people under his name that he named as Sam, Sue, Dorcas, Hezia, Yas, Jack, and Jack's wife, Panethia. And Penn's will in 1701 declared that Africans being enslaved, his African people were to be enslaved and manumitted upon his death, and 100 acres was to be given to one of his enslaved African people named Sam. Nevertheless, though, in Penn's final will in 1711, did not contain the same provisions, and the Africans, people that he had enslaved, were never liberated upon his death, and in 1718, nor by his wife Hannah, who inherited them as a part of his estate. So, even in the early beginnings, even before it's a British colony, as it does become a British colony, you see this system of enslavement throughout the state and as it expands into different areas. In terms of the Caribbean, there's a Caribbean connection to Pennsylvania. In 1684, you're going to have 150 African people who were brought into Philadelphia to be sold into enslavement amongst its 2,000 residents at the time, mainly from the Caribbean and mainly primarily in the location of Barbados. Quaker merchants in Philadelphia relied and sold on enslaved African produce goods from the Caribbean slavers, and particularly from Barbados, and that's why there is that connection there. And Pennsylvania enslavers also preferred young Africans for labor and often requested young males and females in fear of those in their 20s and beyond were too old to learn a trade, or too dishonest, as they would say, or corrupted to be enslaved. And what they meant by that is essentially if you had someone who was older, maybe perhaps they would have ideas of seeking liberation, would seek to rebel, and they didn't necessarily want that. So early records indicate enslaved Africans sought liberation in Pennsylvania even but before there is a term called Underground Railroad. Underground Railroad really comes about early 1800s, but even prior to that, you had those that were resisting. So during the same year that Pennsylvania becomes a British colony, there are semblances of those who are resisting, and you even have history that's there that says that there were African people that devised a plan that did not come to fruition in a large uprising after word spread from Africans revolting in New York in 1712. So early on, you see some of this happening within the state. In terms of 17th century enslavement, so this being the 1600s, in Chester County, enslaved Africans were primarily used for farming and other correlated activities. Labor was dictated, by gender and changed during each season. So during harvesting, the planting season, you had male enslaved Africans that were used for labor in farming in fields, and for the winter, these same male enslaved African people were used to repair buildings, cut firewood, mended fences, and traveled with enslavers to places like Philadelphia and New York, where they were forced to do domestic work such as chimney sweeps, coachmen, cooks, laborers, personal attendants, sailors, and stevedores. And if enslaved by an artisan, then they would have to do things more like creating barrels, boots, furniture, houses, irons, and sails. And female enslaved Africans were restricted to primarily an enslaver's home with labor, domestic labor, such as childcare, cleaning, cooking, and spinning. And generally, enslaved Africans in Pennsylvania were permitted at this time that they did have the ability to have some rights. In the 1600s and in the early 1600s, with being able to marry each other. But as you can see, as we get closer to the end of the 1600s, that starts to change. One of the things that I wanted to have reference to, and I put in here as a depiction, is a depiction of Bacon's rebellion that happens in 1676. Although this does happen in Virginia, specifically in Jamestown, where you have Nathaniel Bacon, he has an issue with the governor. But think of Jamestown at this time like how Washington, D.C. is viewed today as being like the capital of the colonies, the American colonies at the time. And Nathaniel Bacon has an issue with the governor of Virginia at that time and saying that, hey, I want to have more access to land, and I want to have access to the fur trade amongst Native American groups. Even though these Native American groups were attacking some of these English settlements, he still wanted in terms of wealth and prosperity, and felt that those that were elites and large landowners were taking a bulk of those things. So after he tries to several times say, hey, there should be more distribution of land, more access to trade, after a while he gets frustrated and he says, you know what? Maybe the only way to get this done and to make things better and more on an equal playing field is to actually get indentured servants, get enslaved African people at the time, and poor white and poor black individuals, and get them together and say, hey, let's have this uprising, and they actually end up burning Jamestown to the ground. In some semblance, it does have success, all right? But really what it does is it creates this fear amongst other colonies, because many historians will look at this and say this is one of the first times where you do see poor whites, poor blacks coming together for one common cause and what becomes the United States of America eventually. And this caused fear. So from this point on, it was, hey, let's maybe put some legislation in place in the American colonies that will cause a separation here, where people of African descent, if you are enslaved, it's no longer a thing of you could possibly get out of it. And let's end indentured servitude for people of African descent, and saying that, hey, that if you are a person who is of African descent, then you must remain enslaved from the time you're enslaved to the time you perish, and then your children, your children's children. So put it in perpetuity. All right, so you see a lot of legislation start to happen. So in 1683, legislation was passed, and this is after Bacon's Rebellion, that granted law enforcement officers the power to arrest any African enslaved or liberated traveling without permission from an enslaver. Any African who traveled without permission was arrested, jailed, and after imprisonment received 30 lashes from their enslavement. Other legislation prohibited social intercourse with indentured servants and degraded Africans to special courts and judges, where penalties were much harsher than those applied to European Americans. And these laws become even more strict. So this is, God bless you, this is the end of the 1600s, and then as you get the turn of the century into the 1700s, 18th century, you have more laws that are put in place. So in 1700, the Pennsylvania legislature created 2 separate court systems for European Americans Africans. As a result, all Africans, were whether enslaved or liberated, would not be tried by a jury of their peers. In 1726, you have the Pennsylvania legislature established what would become an early form of black codes that enacted the following. It disallowed all Africans from consuming alcohol in or near a house or shop where strong liquor was sold. It allowed local officials to arrest and bind out to service. Even if you were a person who was considered liberated, or some would like to say free, you could be binded out to service. All liberated Africans who were unemployed, a vagrant, or a wanderer, someone who was homeless. It also forbid enslaved Africans to travel more than 10 miles without an enslaver's permission. It required enslaved Africans to be at their enslaver's home by 9 o'clock at night. It disallowed enslaved Africans to meet in groups of more than 4 people. It discouraged interracial marriage even further. And liberated Africans, or those who were considered free, were not permitted to interact with enslaved Africans or invite them to their home without an enslaver's approval. And then one of the most important things is in terms of self-defense and having weaponry, in which enslaved Africans were not to carry weapons or hunt on Native American territory or other people's lands. So as you get into the 18th century, the 1700s, you have more of this solidifying of these laws. When you get to 1780, this is where the Mason-Dixon line becomes significant, or even more significant. As we know, or many may know, that the Mason-Dixon line was a representation of a separation not only from a political standpoint, but also a social standpoint. And many may look at the Mason-Dixon line in terms of maybe references to the Civil War, but in this passing of legislation in 1780, with gradual liberation in Pennsylvania, it became even more prominent. And for me, the Mason-Dixon line, not being far, Chester County borders on Maryland. If you were to leave Lincoln University, many people know where Lincoln University is, which is considered a part of Lower Oxford. Some maps will consider part of Upper Oxford. But if you were to get on Route 1 and drive south, which is a highway, the Mason-Dixon line is about 10 miles away. So that's where I grew up, about 10 miles away. And in one of my best friends, his family had a home that was out in Nottingham. So you have East Nottingham, West Nottingham. His family had a home out in Nottingham. And as kids, we used to play a game along the Mason-Dixon line in terms of having 1 foot in Pennsylvania, 1 foot in Maryland. We would say we were in 2 states at one time. The crazy thing is, we did not understand the significance of where we were located. My friend being someone who was white, me and being black, and not understanding that 200 years ago, prior to when we were born, it would have been a totally different circumstance and how possibly we would have viewed this Mason-Dixon line. So for me, Mason-Dixon line is always something that I think about in terms of my childhood because of being so close. But on March 1st, 1780, you have the Pennsylvania legislature and several representatives, being enslavers themselves, enacted a law for gradual liberation of enslaved African people, stating that children whose mothers were enslaved, because by this time the laws have been changed, that if you were born, you took on the status of your mother and not your father at this point, that children whose mothers were enslaved for life will be liberated at age 28. So Pennsylvania, it was starting to get to this point of, hey, maybe enslavement is something that we want to start pushing towards abolishing, but we don't want to do it outright because it is a profitable business. So let's start with this process of gradual liberation and say, hey, if you are a person born in enslavement, by the time you reach 28, then you can reach liberation. Does that mean every enslaver followed that? Absolutely not. You had some who were supposed to register their enslaved African individuals, so you knew who they were in terms of their age, and once you hit that age, then that was supposed to happen, but not everyone followed along with that, as you can imagine. As you get to more of the 18th century into the 1700s, and specifically with Chester County, so during the 18th century, most residents of Chester County, being those were European American farmers and artisans, which included Quakers, Presbyterians, and Anglicans, as well as those who weren't affiliated with any church. By the end of the colonial period, 19% of European Americans in Chester County owned enslaved African people. The wealthiest landowners had 5 to 10 enslaved Africans, while others had 1 or 2. Enslaved Africans in Chester County were primarily used for domestic work, as I mentioned before, and in 1780, more than 1/3 of all enslaved Africans in Chester County lived in the area surrounding what would become Hensonville, that I will talk about here shortly. So that's giving you all the legislation and all the laws that were taking place that even leads up and getting to the point of the 19th century and the 1800s. And during this time, even before you get to the 19th century, you have African communities that were in existence. You had those that existed of those who were formerly enslaved. You have those that were existed of those who were liberated. And you did have prosperous communities. There's a lot of information that I have about that, and I was trying to get to decide which ones to choose in areas of Pennsylvania. So one of the places that I looked at in my research was in Franklin County. So in Franklin County, Pennsylvania, this is more central PA. It was around this time in 1790 that you had those who were formerly enslaved had found, and many of these coming from Maryland, many of these individuals come from Maryland, they had a place in the Cove Gap that was referred to as a place called Africa. And I thought that was very interesting because it came a light bulb to me. I was like, oh, wow, I know there's other communities that I've come across in research in the United States of America where you see either a name of the use of Africa or you see a name of Little Africa. So here in Franklin County in Cove Gap, you had a community there that existed at the foot of Mount Parnell, and which its members were very prosperous in the areas of being blacksmiths, carpenters, farmers, laborers, quarry men and women, and teachers. Also, there was an African community consisting of 20 to 25 families referred to as Little Africa in Mercersburg in Franklin County. Mercersburg was a prominent area of the Underground Railroad, and even there you had a reference to the continent of Africa, which I thought was very interesting with the time period. And there you have an individual named Robert Black. He was considered to be the captain of the Underground Railroad in the area, and he assisted many of those who were seeking liberation from the surrounding area. Then also in Bedford County, you had something similar where there was another community that was called Africa. And to the west in Bedford County, where you had an African named James Graham who assisted those who were seeking liberation as well by transporting them by wagon from the town of Bedford to Johnstown. Other Africans near Bedford assisted those who were seeking liberation as well. And there's a number of names that I have listed for there. And there was one of the most prominent places by a man named Hugh Barclay, and his home was a part of the Underground Railroad and was referred to as the Grove. Then, in similarity, not exactly the same, Coatesville is the only city in Chester County. All right, if I go back, Coatesville is the only city in Chester County. Steeltown, my grandfather used to work for Lucan Steel many years ago, as well as other members of my family. So it's a place that I knew about because it was the only city in Chester County. I used to get my hair cut there. If anyone's a basketball fan, Richard Hamilton grew up there, and he still comes back to the city and all that stuff, played for the Detroit Pistons. So I knew about Coatesville and some of its history. I knew about the lynching of Zachariah Walker in the early 1900s because I used to pass that PA landmark when I was a kid, and I used to ask my dad questions about, like, what is that? So I knew about Coatesville, but what I didn't know about Coatesville is that prior to it being what we know today as Coatesville, a section of the community was referred to as Hayti. And I thought that was interesting. So I talked to my former pastor in my church who grew up in Coatesville and asked him a couple questions about, hey, what was this Hayti community? And he said, I don't have a lot of information about it, but what I can tell you is that some of the original inhabitants believe that it is a reference to the Haitian Revolution and how that became such a symbol for people of African descent in the United States after it happened. Of course, beginning in the late 1700s and in the early 1800s, it's going to be the first time you're going to have formerly enslaved African people rising up, overthrowing those that were in power, which was the French at the time. And not only were they able to defeat the French once, but twice. All right? And sometimes that information gets skipped out on when Napoleon Bonaparte is discussed, who was overseeing the military at that time. So in connecting these communities and these names, I thought the use of people of African descent using Africa, using Little Africa, and even Hayti. And come to find out, there is, I never was able to get the person's name, but somebody had told me about this individual who's actually doing research on Hayti communities across the United States and trying to see if there's any connection between them and wondering how did they come about, and even the different spellings, because some you see spelled this way, others you see spelled like Haiti, H-I-T-I, as well as different variations. So I thought that was interesting in my research as well as connecting this. Hensonville, a community that I mentioned before. Hensonville Many may know Lincoln University, Pennsylvania in Chester County being the first degree granting historically black college and university. As mentioned before, Cheney comes in existence before. Cheney comes in 1837. It didn't grant college degrees. So there's always a back and forth on who was the first. It's very simple. That's all you need to know. But it's still a rivalry that still happens to this day. But attending Lincoln University and growing up in Oxford, I had never heard of this community called Hinsonville. It wasn't until I had already graduated from Temple with my master's degree, and there was a colleague of mine named Susan Chickwam who I was working with. She was doing academic advising. I was an academic advisor. And she had this book that was written by former professors in the English department at Lincoln University with the last name Russo, Paul and Mary Ann Russo, who had come across this all-black community that existed in the early 1800s, beginning in 1830. And she said, hey, I knew you grew up in Oxford. Have you ever heard of this community? I said, no, absolutely not. And she said, hey, I have this book. You can read it. Tell me what you think, and we can talk about it. And that was my first introduction to this information. And since then, my mind has been blown, because in the very beginning of the book, there's mentioning of this guy named Hersey Gray, who had contributed a lot of the information to the professors who ended up writing this book. And I have a friend whose last name is Gray, his first name being Jacob. And I said, hey, Jacob, who is Hersey Gray? Because the Grays are one of the prominent black families in the area. I said, who is this guy Hersey Gray? And he's like, why do you want to know? I said, because he's in a book. He said, well, that's actually my father's name. I said, get out of here. He said, yes, that's my father's name. He said, why? I said, well, there's this book that I'm reading that's talking about your family as well as other black families that are part of this community called Hinsonville. And he said, oh, yeah. He said, I know all about that stuff. That stuff's boring. My dad talks about it all the time. It's family history. He said, hey, yeah, we do a family reunion every year. It's in Nottingham Park. He's like, yeah. I was like, I would love to talk to your dad. And since then, I haven't talked to him in a while because he's been in and out of hospital, but since then we've had many of discussions about this community of Hinsonville, which, as I mentioned, all-black community founded by this man named Emory Hinson, where he's able to buy land in the area and bring in other prominent families. At first, it's going to be the Walls that come in, the Walls family. Then there's going to be those like the Amoses that come in, as well as the Glasgows that come in. Those are some of the original families that come to this area of Hinsonville. And as it develops, this same land of Hinsonville eventually becomes Ashman Institute, all right, which is Lincoln University before it changes its name. So Ashman Institute gets founded in 1854, and then becomes Lincoln University after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Some of the first students who attend Lincoln University come from this community of Hinsonville, like James Amos, like Thomas Amos, and the founding of Ashman Institute. Many will give the shortened version of the story that it was this institution that was founded for the education of black men, and then women almost 100 years later are accepted to the institution, which is very interesting because now, and I work at Lincoln University, I would say the student population is probably 60% women, and even though the institution wasn't found for that purpose. So it's very interesting with that. But with that, the founder of the institution, John Miller Dickey, it was for having black men get their theology degree and then becoming Christian missionaries to be sent over to Liberia as a part of the American Colonization Society. So learning this history and learning what were the beginnings of Ashman Institute, learning about this community was very interesting to me because I had never heard of it before growing up in the area. But Lincoln University, I would say probably in the last 10 years, has really taken on this history and really has been in recognition of it and its importance. It was made up of farmers. You did have those who were into real estate as well, some very wealthy individuals that lived in this area. One of the individuals, I believe George Walls, actually had stock in one of the banks in Oxford. Oxford, predominantly white community. Lincoln University or Ashman Institute was actually supposed to be built in downtown Oxford, but the white residents did not want it there, and that's why it's located on the outskirts. By 1870, the community starts to dwindle. Many of its residents participated in the Civil War, became wounded. I believe 2 out of the 18, I believe, that participated in the Civil War passed away during the war, but others were wounded, and the community started to decline and eventually became a part of Lincoln University Village, which if you go to Lincoln University today, Old Baltimore Pike, this is the only building that's left standing from Hinsonville, which is the church that was built, I believe, in 1845, Hosanna Church. And there in the front that you'll see these gravestones are some of the Civil War veterans who participated. And there's a whole history behind that I do a different presentation on, but it's very good, interesting history. Something else that caused me of interest in terms of community and community building in Chester County or near Chester County, on the border of Chester County and Lancaster County, you had Christiana. And Christiana is not far from my home church in Ackland. And I had never heard of this resistance, or what some historians call a riot, until I was doing more of my research. I knew in my church that downstairs there was a door on display, and there was a sign that said that there was a old bullet hole in the door from where those who were seeking liberation and were being chased by kidnappers, where there was a shot that was fired and it penetrated the church door, and that's on display downstairs. But I never knew how much my church was connected to what happens with the Christian resistance. So 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act gets passed, very significant. Different from the one in 1793, essentially where you could have a U.S. Marshal could come deputize anyone, say, hey, there is a person, there's an enslaver that says they are missing property or people, and saying that, hey, you have to come find these people, there's a warrant out for their arrest, and you have to come help me. And if you don't want to, then you could be arrested, you could face a year in jail, you could face a $1,000 fine, a lot of money at that time, even a lot of money now. And this caused widespread change to the locality of black communities in the area of Pennsylvania, specifically southeastern Pennsylvania, because at this time you have no rights in terms of court. It was your word against someone who was a European American. And there was incentivization for judges in these cases, and saying that if you were convicted as being a quote-unquote runaway, then the judge got $10. If you were found to not be, then the judge only got $5. So there was more of an incentive to say, hey, this person was this person who ran away. So it had this large impact, and you're going to see upwards of 30,000 people of African descent leave the United States of America and head to places like Canada, places in the Caribbean like Haiti, even South America, even back to Africa. You had an early back to Africa movement that was happening in the 1800s and continues on into the 1800s. So the Christiana resistance happens on September 11th, oddly enough, 1851. And you have this enslaver named Edward Gorsuch, who believes that 4 of his quote-unquote runaways were living at the house of this gentleman named William Parker, who was a black man living in Christiana. He had been enslaved in Maryland, had gained liberation. He actually knew Frederick Douglass back when they were both enslaved, and they actually end up reconnecting later on, where he's able to see Frederick Douglass as his public speaker, and it inspires him to learn how to read and write himself, William Parker. So William Parker, upon gaining liberation and ending up in Lancaster County, one of the things he wanted to do early on was organize the not only the black residents, but also the white residents there, and saying that if there is if there is a kidnapper who's going to come in this area, or a slave catcher come in this area, we need to be organized to fight against this. And he does this, and this is in the 1800s, so it's very remarkable. He was very much in support of self-defense. And so he's able to do this in organized communities. So he hears about Edward Gorsuch and these group of people with a deputy named Deputy Klein that's coming. His son, Edward Gorsuch's son, is coming along with this posse as well. And they're coming to make their way to William Parker's house. William Parker is tipped off beforehand that they are coming. So he's organized, he's ready. On the early morning, September 11th, before the sun comes up, they're notified that this posse is in the area, and William Parker is in the home with some of the individuals that Edward Gorsuch is looking for, as well as his wife. His children are staying over at his mother-in-law's house, and they are there armed and prepared to do battle. And upon arriving there, it's not sure by historians who fires the first shot into the upper window. Some will say it was those that would belong to William Parker's household. Others say it belongs to Edward Gorsuch. But there is violence that does ensue. And eventually what essentially happens is that Edward Gorsuch becomes fatally wounded. His son is wounded as well, but he doesn't pass away. He's able to survive. And they're able to push out the rest of the posse members who end up surviving and making their way back to Maryland. Upon this happening, and there's debate about how many participated. Some will say that it was it was upwards of 50. Some say it was upwards of several hundred. It depends on the source that you're looking at. But this became significant because a person had essentially died as a result of trying to put the law that stated that they could go get their property. So for Marylanders, this was an extreme violation of federal law. and they wanted retribution. So one of the things that happens is there's going to be a large indictment, over 100 people. It's going to be the largest indictment for treason. Why treason? Because with treason, it resulted in the death penalty. And eventually, those that were considered to be participants within it they're not convicted of this. But William Parker and some of the individuals in the household have to make their way up to Canada after this incident happens. And there's a whole story behind it, and because of time, I won't go into detail. But William Parker and those who participated are able to get help by a number of different individuals, one of them being Frederick Douglass when they get to New York, and Frederick Douglass allows them to stay at his home in New York and is able to usher them over into Canada, where William Parker does stay. He does come back to Pennsylvania, at least for a Lincoln University graduation, as well as another event, but for the most part, he lives out his time in the Toronto area. The individuals here pictured is Samuel Hopkins and Peter Wood. Samuel Hopkins is the one here. This is outside of William Parker's house before it collapses. This is the Christiana Resistance incident happens in 1851, and I believe this photo was taken around 1895. And Peter Wood and Samuel Hopkins were very instrumental in the Christiana Resistance and fighting those kidnappers who were coming to kidnap those African people. And this is no longer in the family of Samuel Hopkins. I believe it's in one of the, I don't know if it's a library or history center off the top of my head, but I believe they have ownership of this. But Samuel Hopkins is very interesting in having connection to my grandfather, because I believe it's going to be his grandson who pastors my church and becomes really good friends with my grandfather. And I believe many of the Christiana Resistance participants are actually buried in the old cemetery of my church, which is overgrown, and they're trying to get it redone and all that stuff. But it's a very interesting history, and some of the members of my church talk about this quite often. So it becomes more of a personal thing with me, and especially talking about community. One of the people who helps during the Christiana Resistance and who is more well known in the York area is William C. Goodrich. I wanted to make sure I highlighted him as well as another individual, because not everybody was a farmer. Not everybody was a domestic, and you had those who were actually well-to-do, living very well in some of these communities, and were business people. So at York, you have, he was formerly enslaved William C. Goodrich. He assisted those along the Underground Railroad in finding liberation. He was able to gain liberation from himself at the age of 16 from Baltimore, Maryland. And upon gaining liberation, he first lives in New York, where he works as a barber and attends a African rights convention. Afterwards, he returns to York in 1840, where he had been used as a slave labor as a tanner at the age of 6. It is in York, Pennsylvania, where Goodrich becomes a wealthy businessman. He sold candy, household goods, medical supplies, toys, as well as owned a line of railroad cars that assisted those that were formerly enslaved in gaining liberation, along with Stephen Smith, as well as a man named William Whipper, who were also prominent abolitionists in the area of York County. Goodrich owned the largest building in York County at Center Hall. It was 5 stories tall and included a photographic studio. His residence on 123 Philadelphia Street in York became a location to assist those who were seeking freedom. And Stephen Smith, a business partner of his as well, assisted those who were formerly enslaved as well in terms of gaining liberation. Originally, he resided in a township in Dauphin County, which is central Pennsylvania, and he was enslaved, but he was manumitted at the age of 28, and he works at a lumberyard in Columbia. And it's at this lumberyard where he becomes very successful, very successful, and he becomes a targeted individual by local European Americans there. And on September 2nd, 1834, what I call a mob of European Americans attacked Stephen Smith's Front Street office, and they actually burned his lumberyard business, and he eventually has to leave the business and moves to Philadelphia. Another person, don't have a picture of, but more of a map and location of where he was, and this has been more out in the Pittsburgh area, is a man named John C. Peck. Similar to William C. Goodrich, he was a barber. He worked as an agent for an abolitionist newspaper, the Emancipator and the Weekly Advocate. And John Peck was one of those who also helped those not only in the Pittsburgh area, but also in the area of Carlisle. Like other African barbers, the barbershop allowed for Peck to gather information where he was able to overhear conversations from customers to be able to assist those in finding liberation. And also at his barbershop, he kept an anti-enslavement literature such as that written by William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. John C. Peck would later create the Carlisle Anti-Slavery Society, which represented society and he represented the society as a delegate at the 1837 convention in Harrisburg that assembled the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. And during that same year, John Peck would move out to Pittsburgh and he would open what was called John C. Peck's Oyster House that became a part of the Underground Railroad. There is an oyster house still there in Pittsburgh. Some believe it's the original location, some not. I haven't been able to verify that, but it is my hope to visit the next time I am out in Pittsburgh to see if I can find that information. Thank you. Last thing I'll talk about is here in Westchester. Westchester is located in Chester County as well, a place that I visited a multitude of times. I was actually in Westchester this past weekend. My friend was celebrating his 40th birthday, and in Westchester, that was a main area for Underground Railroad activity in Chester County as well. And out of the 132 Underground Railroad agents that operate in Westchester, 33 were people of African descent. So in this bottom right-hand corner is a person you may have seen before, is Abraham Shadd. Prior to moving to Canada, he did live in Westchester, and prior to Westchester, I believe his family lived in Delaware, if I'm not mistaken. But Abraham Shadd was instrumental in assisting those who were seeking liberation, and it's believed that he even helped Josiah Henson gain liberation because they did know each other, and helped Josiah Henson end up in Dresden, Canada, at a settlement called Dawn, where he became a minister. There's debate oftentimes about Josiah Henson in terms of if his life was an inspiration for Harriet Beecher Stowe and her Uncle Tom's Cabin. There's much back and forth about that, but it is believed that Josiah Henson was that person who inspired that book. But Abraham Shadd was instrumental in helping him gain his liberation. Like John B. Fashion, John Peck, and Stephen Smith, Abraham Shadd also sold subscriptions of the abolitionist newspaper, The Emancipation. In addition, he owned 8 buildings in Westchester, and in 1844 opened the first African school that was the first public school in the town of Westchester, and it was called Harmony School. And he opened this school with this gentleman here named Benjamin Freeman. Harmony School operated until 1857, and it was located across the home of Benjamin Freeman, which was a station on the Underground Railroad in Westchester. By 1849, Abraham Shadd had become the first, this is by the time he had moved to Canada, he becomes the first elected public official in Canada as a person of African descent, and this is in the Raleigh Town Council in Canada, which is modern-day Ontario. Another person who is of fame with the Shadd family is his daughter being Mary Ann. She was well known in the area of Chester County as well, and even in Canada when her and her family moved there, in which she's going to be the first woman in North America to create a weekly newspaper called the Provincial Freedman. Mary Ann Shadd was a teacher. She had taught in Wilmington, Delaware, where the Shadd family was previously, but she also taught in Westchester, Norristown, Pennsylvania, and Trenton, New Jersey. And she was a very young teacher by the age of 21. After the Fugitive Slave Act, her and her family moved to Canada, where she has her newspaper, and she still becomes a voice for those who are seeking liberation in the United States to places like Canada. Because some that emigrate to Canada, they believe that Canada was only a temporary space until laws and legislation, the end of enslavement, would allow those who had moved to Canada to move back. But Mary Ann Shadd was very much saying, no, you can stay right here in Canada. You don't have to go back to the United States of America, and you could have better liberties here. So she was very outspoken on that. Last is this quote. Because when I talk about community and I talk about those who were able to persevere and display courage despite the laws at the time, I do want it to be known and taken note that many of individuals and collectives were willing to take up arms and defend their homes by any means possible and to protect other people. One of those people is Martin Delany. Martin Delany getting much of his what's the word I want to say? Getting much of his prominence, I would say, out in the Pittsburgh area in terms of Underground Railroad. Maybe you know him as being an early officer in the Civil War, being the first black officer in the Army. Maybe you know him in terms of early Pan-African movements. But Martin Delany was a person who very much was for self-defense. And one of the famous quotes that he has after the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act, in which he's speaking to the mayor of Pittsburgh, he says, "Honorable Mayor, I have therein learned that a man has a right to defend his castle with his life, even unto that taking of life. Sir, my home is my castle, and that a castle are none but my wife and my children, as free as the angels of heaven, and whose liberty is as sacred as the pillars of God. If any man approaches that house in search of a slave, if he crosses the threshold of my door, and I do not lay him a lifeless corpse at my feet, I hope the grave may refuse my body a resting place, and righteous heaven my spirit a home. No, he cannot enter that house, and we both live." And he's not the only one that felt that way. There were many others. As I mentioned, William Parker was very much like that, had a similar quote as well. But just to make note that, no, people of African descent have been fighting from the time enslavement came about, before there's even a term for the Underground Railroad, that this has always been a thing of those fighting, resisting, and protecting their home and protecting their community. And for me, that shows a lot of the courage and perseverance of people of African descent during this time. I thank you very much for your time and listening, and thank you.
All right, everyone, I'm just going to read a few highlights from Mr. Scott's biography as he makes his way to our podium. Mr. Donald Scott is an author, historian, and journalist known for his in-depth research and writing on Pennsylvania Black history for book publishers such as Houghton Mifflin, Schiffer Publishing, Casemate Brookline Publishers, and Oxford University Press. African American National Biography, edited by Harvard professors Henry Louis Gates, Jr. and Evelyn Higginbotham. Scott's numerous articles and columns appeared in newspapers ranging from the Philadelphia Inquirer to Montgomery Newspaper Incorporated. He often explores the heroics of some of the Civil War's first federal black Civil War soldiers at Camp William Penn that stood in what is today Cheltenham Township. Dozens of other historical figures, as well as his South Carolina Gullah Geechee and Virginia ancestors and their migrations to Pennsylvania, and various notable families in the Commonwealth. Those historic families include the African-descended Montiers, the Boustilles, included in his 2025 Brookline Casemate publishing book, The Montiers, From Enslavement to Paul Robeson and Beyond. He has also served as a tenured professor at the Community College of Philadelphia and adjunct at Temple University, Cheyney University, Pierce University, and University of the Sciences. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. Donald Scott.
Thank you. Thank you. Great.
Hold tap, everybody. Good afternoon. So thanks for that wonderful introduction. I thank Dr. Waskie, Dr. Okur for this invitation. So I remember as an adjunct professor at Temple, about 15 to 20 years ago, sponsoring a class presentation by the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and writer David Zucchino, who spoke about his landmark Philadelphia Inquirer series concerning South African apartheid. And the theme for the class was courage in journalism. So today I am really, really humbled and thankful to speak at Temple about this really critical theme, courage and perseverance on the Underground Railroad, and the related topics, especially as it pertains to the contributions of black families in the Philadelphia area, many that I examined in my book concerning the Montiers and extended family lines, as well as my earlier book about Camp William Penn, the first and largest federal facility to train black soldiers during the Civil War, that Edward McLaughlin will speak about right after me, and he's done some really excellent work on that. I think, Ed, you have books on sale too?
No, I
Afterwards?
only have,
Right.
these are for review. My books are in the car.
Right, oh, okay. And then I also have books on sale, so afterwards, if anyone's interested, please feel free to, if you don't want to buy, just come by and take a little look. So in fact, what I'll be specifically speaking about today is Black families' fight for liberation, stories of survival, escape, defiance, and upward mobility, especially as it pertains to my 2025 book about the Monteers that you see on the screen there. The struggles and triumphs of such heroic African American families by way of the Underground Railroad and the incredible challenges before and afterwards can provide a template to help us deal with some of the really tremendous storms of today. For many years, I've researched the Monteers and related family lines, including Hiram and Elizabeth Monteer, who you see on the screen. By the way, these paintings were done way back in 1841 by a white artist, and we'll talk about that artist and these fantastic artwork that today hangs at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I often thought about the origins of the family when I started expanding my research on them. I have written a number of articles for several publications, as well as the immense challenges they've had, their ancestors and descendants, and some of the pro-racist obstacles that they faced in the societies that they lived in. A society that was really institutionalized slavery. So through the miracle of AI, you see what I think is a pretty good depiction of two of the principal characters in the book. So this story is about family dynasties that began in 1710, way back in 1710, when a woman named Cremona was born, a black woman, who was likely a slave to Humphrey Maury, Philadelphia's first mayor. A relationship developed between Cremona and Humphrey's son, Richard, about 1736, after his father died in 1715. It appears that when the union between Cremona and Richard commenced, Richard's first wife, the European descendant Anne Turner Maury, may have been very ill or near death. So that's a pretty important detail. However, some sources say that Anne returned to England upset with Richard for one reason or the other, perhaps due to alleged marital improprieties or other reasons. During most of the relationship between Richard and Cremona, especially early on, their union was visible and known in the Edgehill community of Cheltenham on Richard's estate, as they consistently had children together, possibly an indication that there was deep passion or love. Although, however, some observers argue that such a relationship between a person of such authority and his subordinate could never amount to a reciprocal loving relationship. The couple have 5 children, including a girl also named Cremona, Elizabeth, Robert, Rachel, Caesar, between 1736 and 1746. The roots of what would become multiple generations of African American freedom fighters that actually led to the development of a town called Guineatown in Cheltenham. So it gets into some of the topics that Dr. Denson just spoke about. About the time Richard and Cremona's relationship ended in 1746, when Richard married another European descended woman. Cremona received, likely by way of her negotiation skills, almost 200 acres from him, as well as by then was liberated, likely with at least some or all of her children. So that gives you a little backdrop. Now, according to some sources, Cremona Mori's unidentified enslaved parents, after being captured in Guinea or the upper coast of Africa, may have arrived in the Philadelphia area from Barbados on an early vessel carrying abducted Africans, possibly the ship Isabella that arrived in 1684. Then they were auctioned or sold on or near the Philadelphia waterfront, more than likely quite close to what was called the London Coffee House, near what is today Front and Market. Market back then used to be called High Street, by the way. Early accounts regarding the arrival of such ships indicate that people walking near the waterfront could actually smell the horrible stench of such vessels. About 150 enslaved Africans, as Dr. Denson mentioned, debarked from that ship, many of them enslaved by local Quakers and others who were landowners, even merchants, including the likes of the so-called founding father, Benjamin Franklin. So what I do in chapter 1 of the book is really get into the heritage of Cremona Mori. We know that she was definitely Negro because various documentation indicates exactly that she was a Negro. Now, according to other sources, her maiden name may have been Satterwhite. That's a name with very deep English roots that included some Quakers. Perhaps an indication that she was part European. Some sources indicate that in England, the Satterwhites were very early and deeply involved in the enslavement of Africans. We're talking about going way back to the 1400s. Meanwhile, other sources indicate Cremona was part Native American, specifically the Lenape tribe, who dwelled in our particular area. Some evidence of Native American ancestry, in fact, exists in some of the descendants of this particular family. Did she witness various instances of slavery in the Philadelphia area? Probably so. There's plenty of evidence indicating that groups of slaves chained would walk down what is today Broad Street back in the day in some of the major thoroughfares. So more than likely she did witness the institution of slavery. She probably monitored runaway slave ads that appeared in local publications. Now, of course, the image of the woman is a later photo. I think it was taken in 1940, but you can see the African tribal marks. And these ads often had these detail that was very, very important, especially for historians like myself, because of course you can go back and really get to the personal characteristics of these Africans. In this case, this was published in the Pennsylvania Journal Weekly Advertiser, but a lot of such ads were published in Benjamin Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette. So Franklin got pretty wealthy from running these sorts of ads. Now, Cremona's descendants became affiliated with these churches. And these churches, of course, are legendary in Philadelphia. One founded by Absalom Jones, the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas. And you can see the great Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. So these were founded in the early 1800s, late 1700s. Her descendants were very integral in founding and joining both congregations. In fact, my own family from South Carolina, once they arrived in the Great Migration during the late 1800s, early 1900s, my mother's family actually joined Mother Bethel AME Church. So I remember going there often as a kid. One of the associates of both of those theologians was James Forten. So James Forten became a Revolutionary War hero during his teenage years when he was captured by the British and held in a really horrific prison ship in the New York harbor, returning to Philadelphia, eventually becoming one of the wealthiest and most influential African Americans. He is considered to be a black founding father. He was really politically astute, helped to start those historic denominations that I just mentioned. And very, very important is he co-founded what we know as the Free African Society. That was really the first major or documented civil rights organization in America. By the way, bless you, the Monteers and Bustills were members of that congregation. In chapter 2, I get into the background of the Maury family. So Humphrey Maury was the first mayor of Philadelphia. His son, Richard, had the relationship with Cremona Maury. They're the ones who had the 5 children. What I found interesting about the Maurys is that their history goes way back in England. I think I traced them all the way back to the 1200s or so. They became Quakers. They came to America to get their own freedom and liberty, political freedom, and so on. But when they got here, of course, they became slaveholders. So those are some of the topics that I probe in this particular chapter. I found it pretty fascinating, some of the hardships that they faced. By the way, on their way over on the ship, the Europeans, of course, the conditions were nowhere like what Africans had to endure, but the conditions on European ships weren't great. Many of them died of disease and so on. This chapter also gets into the relationship of the Maury family with folks like William Penn. And of course, William Penn founded the colony, a Quaker. And so what was their relationships? How much land did they actually buy from Penn, and so on? And it was an awful lot. Cremona also witnessed, or likely witnessed, abolitionist activities, possibly of Benjamin Lay. They were more or less contemporaries. And Benjamin Lay was this really incredible anti-slavery abolitionist from England. He was Welsh. He was said to be hunchback and short. And he went on basically a one-person campaign entering these Quaker meeting houses during their meetings and protesting slavery in a number of ways. He would be thrown out of these meetings. And so he was a very prolific, interesting figure. And there's probably little doubt that Cremona witnessed some of his protests. By the way, Cremona very early on was a Quaker. So that's another interesting element, that she was a black, very early black Quaker. Chapter 3 really gets into whether the relationship between Richard Morey and Cremona could have been exploitative. Mainly, Richard likely exploiting Cremona, because in the end, even though she does receive 200 acres of land from him, during that relationship, much of that relationship, it was a slave-master relationship. Then she became free, and it was an employee-employer relationship. Based on her status as a black woman, she was more or less at the bottom of the proverbial totem pole in terms of empowerment. So this chapter really gets into what was that relationship like. Personally, I have my perspective. Personally, I believe it had to be exploitative. The question is to what degree. I write the chapter in the book in a way that I hope gives both sides of the possibilities. So I think this is one of the more interesting chapters in terms of the dynamics between so-called slaveholders and the enslaved, especially when it came to black women. The other thing I get into are some really comparative instances of how prevalent black women were raped during this period, later on, and then even after slavery. Here you see this, I think, pretty good depiction of what Richard may have looked like and Cremona about the time they met, or the relationship developed, I should say. So Richard was about 60 years old, Cremona about 26. The relationship developed, as I said, in 1736 and would last until 1746. But what I examined, and Dr. Denson did mention this, is that black people during this period faced really tremendous risk, and especially if they were in an interracial relationship. There were laws on the books that actually forbade interracial relationships. So she could have been taken back into slavery. Her children could have been possibly sold. Probably was saved. There was the power of Richard Morey being the son of Philadelphia's first mayor. Plus, the relationship probably was much more visible in the Cheltenham Township area. So that would have been, of course, outside of Philadelphia. By the way, just to clarify though, at that point, Cheltenham Township was considered, or Cheltenham was considered to be a part of Philadelphia. So I should say the outer limits of what was in Philadelphia. In the book, I get into comparing that relationship with that of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Of course, most of you know about that relationship. Jefferson had the relationship with Sally Hemings. It probably started about when she was about age 14. He takes her to Europe with his daughter. Basically, she's the caretaker of Jefferson's daughter, and Hemings, at least according to most historians, believe that she came back pregnant. Most historians believe that Sally Hemings was wise enough in Europe to begin bargaining with Jefferson. She knew that in France that she was actually a free woman. So she basically, according to most historians, believe that she said, well, I'll come back to America with you. I'm just paraphrasing. If you meet certain conditions, such as I should be free after a certain amount of years, and so should my children. That's extremely important with respect. In this particular geographic area, probably even at Temple University. One of the really interesting things is that during the 1970s, Pickens actually found these old images, paintings of his family members under the bed of an older family member. So we had them refurbished. In the process, he found out that these were very, very rare images of middle-class African Americans. They were pointed in 1841 by a guy named Franklin Street. In my research, I found out that Franklin Street and his family are buried right near my residence in Cheltenham Township along Huntington Pike. So I was able to go, of course, to the cemetery, get some documentation, and really get some great information about his background. He actually may have ties to the famous artist Thomas Sully of the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. A couple of the Monteers and Bustales were actually artists too, and may have been, one of them may have been trained by Thomas Sully. So those are some of the things that I get into in this chapter. Of course, several of them were involved in the Underground Railroad. So you can see this image of Joseph Casey Bustale, his wife and daughter, and then Sarah Humphrey Bustale, mother of the pioneering black genealogist Anna Bustale Smith, who became basically the mother of what we call black genealogy. So there's a lot of really interesting stories and ties there regarding the Underground Railroad. In fact, they had ties too, not family ties, but they had ties in terms of Underground Railroad connections with William Steele, the father of the Underground Railroad. And most of you know about William Steele, but you can see on the screen there's some basic information about him. And I learned that they were going to some of the same meetings, the Monteers and Bustales, with William Steele, organizing and then executing some of their plans. David Bustale Bowser and his grandfather Cyrus Bustale were ancestors of the iconic Paul Leroy Robeson. So you can see David Bustale Bowser here. He created the flags with his wife, the 11 regiments out of Camp William Penn. So you can see this wonderful revolutionary flag. I call it revolutionary because you actually see a black soldier killing a white soldier. And so that sort of imagery was just unheard of. And so it was really revolutionary. He also painted portraits of John Brown and Abraham Lincoln. So John Brown actually stayed at his residence in Philadelphia. And you can see later in 1865, 1866, he painted Lincoln's portrait from a steel painting. The family became so well known, the Bustales and the Monteers, that in 1948, Carter G. Woodson, the father of Negro history, actually wrote a series of stories with Anna Bustale Smith. So this is an excerpt from that publication and the journal. Some of the distinguished family members, including Gertrude Bustale Moselle, who was a very famous black journalist, who actually married Dr. Nathan Moselle. You can see him at the far right, who founded Mercy Douglas Hospital. And so there are a number of other connections with the Tanners and other people. Regretfully, Maria Louisa Bastille, a direct descendant of Cremona Mori by way of the daughter Elizabeth, was Paul Robeson's mother, and she died in a tragic fire. The son, Ben, actually saw her clothes set ablaze while she was cooking. Ember from the flames lit. So that impacted the boys the rest of their lives, including Ben, who became a famous preacher. You can see these images of Paul Robeson himself. Bill Pickens remembered Robeson singing at family gatherings. And you can see the father there. They became very close after the mother's death. Paul was the only child left in the residence. So father and son became extremely close. Bill Pickens' grandfather co-founded the NAACP and became the first field secretary of the NAACP. Harriet Pickens, related to William Pickens, or Bill Pickens, became the first black wave, along with Francis Willis. So you can see them here. I think out of 80,000 waves, there were only several African-American, initially, several African-American waves. Here's a picture of Bill Pickens, who was very prolific in giving events throughout the Philadelphia area regarding his family. And he received great publicity, not only in the Enquirer, but the New York Times. He associated with people such as General Colin Powell, Bill Clinton, and many others. By the way, he became a very important corporate executive. Chapter 10, we're just about finished, gets into honoring the ancestors, gets into where some of them are buried at the historic Eaton Cemetery. And it gets into Bill Pickens, at the time of his death, still looking for the remains of his family. So we know they were supposedly removed and relocated to another cemetery, but we researchers have never been able to find out where. There's hardly any documentation whatsoever. So one of the things that we're doing is I'm encouraging them to use ground-penetrating technology to actually determine if those graves are there. Paul Robeson house in West Philadelphia. You can see one of the descendants, Joyce Mosley, to the right. And so she works there, and so there is some really great documents and other memorabilia there commemorating the great Paul Robeson in West Philadelphia. It just reopened, so if you haven't been there, of course you should get there, and I think you'll learn some really remarkable things. One of the things I learned about Paul Robeson is before he died, he received 50 electroshock treatments. His son, in an archival film, he's on record as saying he believed those shock treatments were very suspicious. Now remember, Robeson was very outspoken about black liberation. The U.S. government was very angry with him. He was a victim of the McCarthy hearings. They accused him of being a communist and so on. He died in his, while living at his sister's house. Actually, I think the hospital was Graduate Hospital he died in. 1976, ironically, during America's bicentennial. One of the quotes, this quote that I really thought was very relevant for today, I'll leave you with this quote that Robeson once said, "Because my father was a slave and my people died to build this country, and I'm going to stay right here and have a part of it just like you. And no fascist-minded people like you will drive me from it." And that's from his book, Here I Stand. So I think that's very relevant today. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your time, and keep these people